You were never meant to hear this. The records were burned, the bodies buried, and the last survivor died with a sewn mouth and open eyes. What happened beneath the Covenant Academy wasn't education. It was design. Human engineering masked as righteousness. And every man in power today walks with its shadow stitched into his blood. In Salem's archives, there's a record that doesn't belong. It's dated October 18th, 1761, one day after Benjamin Hartwell's body was quietly removed from Covenant Academy. But the ink isn't aged right. The paper is thicker. And in the margin, in a cipher used only by colonial governors and Freemason liaisons, are two words. Phase 1. Understand this. The Fletcher family didn't simply run an academy. They weren't educators, they were architects. Their mission was never to teach boys Latin and Psalms. It was to dissect the human soul, to learn with brutal precision how much agony it takes to erase defiance, how to grind down willpower layer by layer until what remains is obedience, not out of virtue, but from fear carved into the marrow. Josiah Fletcher wasn't interested in salvation. He was obsessed with structure, control, and the exact calibration of pain to achieve transformation. His methods were mirrored centuries later in Cold War black sites, but in 1734 they were baptized in scripture and sanctified by colonial governors who feared one thing above all, an ungovernable class of men. That's what Covenant was, a test chamber. Not just for the children, but for the future of authority itself. The Fletcher method took boys born into privilege and hollowed them into instruments of domination. Future governors, generals, lawmakers, all conditioned beneath sermons and screams. The boys who survived carried those methods forward into the prison system, military tribunals, even psychiatric institutions. And yet, no one ever asked why the same families kept sending their sons. Because they knew. They knew what the world would require of their children, and they knew Covenant would prepare them not for piety, but for power. The bell of the academy rang 7 times a day, but on the night Benjamin died, it rang 8, and no one ever spoke of the 8th bell. Until now, before the academy's gates were ever built, before the bell rang, before the doctrine of discipline disguised as salvation was even written, there was a man standing alone in the snow outside a scorched meeting house in 1692. That man was Josiah Fletcher's father, Reverend Ephraim Fletcher, and what he witnessed would plant the seed of a legacy steeped not in faith, but in domination. He watched his congregation turn on itself during the Salem witch trials, not because of real sorcery, but because of fear, guilt, and the desperate need to explain suffering. He saw what no Puritan preacher would admit, that the most effective weapon against rebellion wasn't truth. It was confusion cloaked in sacred purpose. Guilt, shame, ritual, pain. These were not side effects of order, they were order. Ephraim fled Salem before the final hangings, but his son Josiah, he stayed. He watched. 9 years old, eyes wide, silent, observing the way neighbors betrayed neighbors with a whisper, how fear did what no sermon could. He didn't weep when Bridget Bishop swung, he asked questions, and from those questions a doctrine emerged, not Christian, not satanic, but something older. By the time he enrolled at Harvard Divinity School, Josiah had already begun assembling his own theological treatise. Not a manifesto of love or redemption, but a blueprint, a model of psycho-spiritual engineering. In his journals, he refers to it cryptically as the path of 9 chains. Each chain was a phase of conditioning, isolation, ritual deprivation, confession through coercion, erasure of individual identity, reconstruction of ideology, forced complicity, role reversal, obedient dominance, total integration. These were not theories, they were instructions. By 1730, Josiah had tested his methods on apprentices at his parish in Newburyport. 3 boys vanished. One returned mute. No one asked questions. Italians, because their families were paid in silence. By 1734, with Martha's dowry and her connections to Boston's inner circle, Josiah built the Covenant Academy, not as a school, but as an altar. And he didn't seek students. He sought inheritors, only boys with elite bloodlines, only minds with something to lose. Pain, he believed, was only transformational when it shattered pride. That's why Benjamin Hartwell smiled. Not out of disrespect, but because deep down, something in him remembered who he really was. That fleeting moment of joy was his soul fighting back. And that's what made it unforgivable. Because in Josiah's system, a free thought was a revolt, and revolts had to be extinguished. They called her Mother Fletcher in hushed tones, students, instructors, even her own son. But there was nothing maternal about Martha Thornfield Fletcher. She was the architect behind the eyes, the hand inside the glove. If Josiah was the thunder, Martha was the blade gliding silently beneath the surface. She had never believed in the God Josiah preached about, not truly. Her God was order, not the kind etched in stone tablets, but the kind written between lines of trade contracts, hidden in the codes of plantation ledgers, and whispered during late-night gatherings of Boston's elite. Her family had made their fortune not from sugar or spices, but from silence. Slaves traded under false manifests, ministers paid to look away, and always, always, children groomed for obedience. It was Martha who introduced Josiah to the writings of Friedrich Hoffner, a 17th-century Bavarian theologian whose banned manuscript Infans Obsequium argued that the soul of a child could be malleably refined through cycles of disorientation, submission, and reward. The church had burned his texts. Martha had a copy bound in velvet. She studied it the way others studied scripture. It was Martha who devised the three-phase correction model the Academy used on students who resisted transformation. Phase 1, cognitive suspension, deprive the child of sleep, isolate them, and bombard them with conflicting moral doctrines until logic fractured. Phase 2, mirror punishment, make the child watch others suffer for their failures, building unbearable guilt. Phase 3, sacramental reinforcement, deliver forgiveness only after the child confesses invented sins, reinforcing their dependency on the authority structure for absolution. But her genius wasn't cruelty, it was plausibility. She made it look like faith. The rooms were painted white. The punishments had biblical names: Jacob's trial, Jonah's darkness, Lazarus' hour. Parents received letters praising their sons' moral development. The bruises were framed as marks of spiritual growth. She spoke at luncheons with the wives of colonial judges. She donated to churches. She quoted proverbs and smiled softly while describing how breaking a child's will is the highest act of mercy. And people believed her because she looked like the very thing she was destroying, a symbol of virtue. But inside the Academy's basement, Martha became something else. Students reported waking in the night to find her silently watching them, candle in hand, her face expressionless. Some claimed she whispered to herself, not in English but in a language they couldn't place. One boy, Peter Alcott, drew strange symbols he said she had traced onto his chest during prayer. The symbols matched those later found in Hoffner's lost ninth appendix. They never found Peter's body. They graduated boys, but forged weapons. By the time a student left the Covenant Academy, he was no longer a boy. He was a mechanism, hardened, hollowed, coded to obey. The Fletcher family had no interest in creating scholars. They were manufacturing instruments of control, and those instruments would become the backbone of American authority. Let's follow them. Elias Crandall, class of 1742, became a senior magistrate in Virginia. He authored what came to be known as the Crandall Provisions, early legal codes used to discipline rebellious indentured servants and enslaved laborers. The language was clinical, biblical, and cold, but the punishment structures, public humiliation, prolonged isolation, memory deprivation, matched word-for-word methods from Martha Fletcher's journals. Then came Jonathan Brackett. He left the academy in 1746 and soon after joined colonial forces during the French and Indian War. He was remembered by his fellow officers for his innovation, replacing traditional interrogation with controlled confession cycles, breaking native prisoners using moral guilt narratives and familial shame. These tactics were later studied by British intelligence and even appear, eerily intact, in early CIA interrogation manuals from the 1950s. Still think this was just a school? Every boy shaped by the Fletchers became a man with a mission, but they didn't know they were programmed. That's the genius of psychological engineering. It doesn't leave scars you can see. It changes the lens through which you see the world itself. Many of the Academy's alumni ended up shaping penal codes, heading churches, even building the earliest American penitentiaries. And if you think modern prison design is just about efficiency, look again. The Panopticon Tower, the scripture on the walls, the echoing chapel spaces, the silent monastic routines, every element of America's earliest prison architecture mimicked the Covenant Academy's structure exactly, because those boys, broken and remade in Fletcher fire, believed suffering was salvation. And here's the terrifying truth. The system didn't die with the Fletchers. It metastasized. Their doctrine, the idea that the soul must be shattered and reshaped for obedience, became the blueprint for institutions across the emerging United States, schools, prisons, military academies, even religious seminaries. A hidden legacy, not of education, of domination. So if you've ever wondered why certain systems feel less like support and more like surveillance, if you've ever felt a force watching, judging, silently expecting your compliance, you're not paranoid. You're touching the ghost of the Fletcher doctrine. And now that you know, you're already marked. They called them reflection chambers, but what happened inside had nothing to do with reflection and everything to do with annihilation. When the sealed basement beneath the Covenant Academy was unearthed during the 1987 restoration of Salem's Old North Church, workers discovered what they first believed were wine cellars. But what they found were rows of stone cells, airless, silent, cruelly proportioned. On the interior walls, Latin inscriptions scratched with nails, psalms turned inside out, pleas, numbers, names, dates. And in one room, a child's drawing etched in soot of a woman's face split in half. This was not a dungeon for criminals. It was a forge for obedience. These chambers were the crucible of the Fletcher method, the location where the soul was, systematically unmade. Boys as young as 10 were sent down for minor infractions, speaking out of turn, looking indifferent during sermons, or worse, displaying signs of independent thought. But the isolation was just the beginning. According to the journals recovered from a sealed crate behind the Academy's chapel pulpit, the process was designed to take place over 3 stages: submission, fragmentation, reconstruction. In stage 1, the boy was deprived of all sensory stimuli. No sound, no light, just a hard floor and biblical verses shouted at irregular intervals through a hole in the stone wall, long enough to erase time. Stage 2 began when Martha or Samuel would enter, usually around the 3rd or 4th day. They would speak gently at first, ask about dreams, about shame, about unspoken sins. But soon, the questioning would turn. The interrogator would shift into accusation, invoking the child's dead relatives, using the names of his friends, quoting letters he had written home. The goal was not to punish, it was to crack identity. One boy, Silas Green, was held for 19 days. His confession, Ritty, and in his own trembling hand and smuggled out by a sympathetic groundskeeper, read simply, "I no longer know if I am saved. I no longer know if I am Silas." This is how obedience was born, not through threat, but through erasure. Now ask yourself, how many institutions today still use isolation as correction? How many children sit in sterile rooms for behavioral realignment? What if that system never ended? The reflection chambers weren't just physical, they were philosophical, and their echo has traveled uninterrupted into modern systems of discipline and control. Comment: the veil is thinning, the veil is thinning. If you're beginning to see how deep this goes. The American Revolution is painted as a noble struggle for liberty, powdered wigs, grand speeches, and the birth of a nation under God. But beneath the flag-waving and declarations of freedom, something far older and far darker was spreading like a silent infection, seeded by those who had graduated from the Covenant Academy. You see, many of the Academy's successful alumni didn't vanish after graduation. They were placed, like chess pieces, into emerging networks of influence. Some became judges, others military officers, and a few were recruited by a proto-intelligence network spearheaded by a secret committee within the Continental Congress. This was before the CIA, before the OSS, yet its tactics were unmistakably modern. Its methods: psychological profiling, behavioral conditioning, targeted moral correction. These weren't battlefield techniques, these were mind war strategies, and their fingerprints trace back to Salem. Letters exchanged between Josiah Fletcher and a little-known figure named Elias Broom, a recruiter for Washington's Culper Ring, reveal that at least 5 Covenant Academy graduates were installed within revolutionary intelligence units. Their purpose wasn't just to spy, it was to test methods of coercion under the guise of patriotism. In one intercepted letter dated July 1777, Samuel Fletcher, then 36 years old and serving in a military advisory role, wrote, "What is required is not just loyalty, but internal obedience, the kind that survives interrogation, the kind that does not waver when fathers are pitted against sons." That phrasing, internal obedience, appears again decades later in US military interrogation manuals. Coincidence? During the war, several captured loyalists were not executed, but re-educated in secluded locations in upstate New York and western Pennsylvania. Techniques included isolation, sleep deprivation, and moral inversion sessions, methods identical to those perfected in the reflection chambers of the Academy. What they tested in Salem became battlefield doctrine. What they called righteousness was psychological warfare. These men, bred in an institution that broke children for God's glory, now applied those same methods to reshape the very soul of a nation in the womb, and no one questioned it, because the results were effective. But here's the question that should freeze the blood of any man listening to this right now. If the birth of freedom was incubated in control, then what were we actually born into? The darkness didn't die with the war, it evolved. When the revolution ended, the chains didn't fall off, they just changed form. A new republic had been born. But beneath its marble monuments and parchment promises, a more invisible architecture was being laid. One not of stone, but of silence, of compliance. And at the center of that hidden structure stood the earliest American prison system, designed not just to punish, but to reprogram the human soul. The inspiration, not Europe, not Enlightenment philosophy, but the Covenant Academy of Salem. You see, in the years immediately following the war, Josiah Fletcher, though officially retired, began corresponding with Pennsylvania state officials regarding moral correctional institutions for the deviant poor. Among these officials was Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a physician obsessed with mental health and social reform. Rush proposed a new kind of prison, one that would cure the criminal mind through discipline, silence, and isolation. His proposal became the foundation for Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, the first prison in the world designed around solitary confinement. And guess what? Its earliest architects included former Covenant students. One of them, Jonathan Hale, had overseen dormitory discipline at the academy for nearly a decade. His diaries, unearthed in 1963, contain chilling sketches of the reflection chambers beneath the academy, and nearly identical diagrams for what would become prison cells at Eastern State. Coincidence? No. Continuation. These cells weren't built for rehabilitation. They were built to strip identity, to sever a man from his former self, to erase his inner voice until only obedience remained. Just like the academy's spiritual correction rooms, prisoners were isolated, starved of sensation, and bombarded with scripture. Guards were trained to avoid eye contact. Prisoners weren't even allowed to speak, not to each other, not to themselves. It was called the Pennsylvania system, but it was Salem in disguise. And here's the sickest part. It worked. It broke men, fast, but not into better citizens, into shells, silenced, reconstructed, rewired. By 1829, this method had spread like wildfire. Across New York, Massachusetts, Ohio, the academy may have closed its doors, but its ideology had metastasized. You've been told America was founded on liberty, but from the beginning, its foundation has been the science of control, forged in silence, sharpened in fear. And if you're still listening, now's the time to participate. Comment the phrase, "Order is a prison." Type it twice, not just for the algorithm, but to mark your transformation. In the winter of 1782, just months after the Treaty of Paris declared American independence, Josiah Fletcher vanished from public life. Officially, he had retired to a small estate near Concord. Unofficially, he had begun writing what he called the Doctrine of Correction, a text he claimed was not his own, but dictated. Dictated by what exactly? In the margins of his surviving journals, Fletcher refers repeatedly to the voice behind the veil, an intelligence he first encountered in the final days of the academy. During the war, he had grown increasingly reclusive, descending nightly into the lowest of the reflection chambers, where he would meditate for hours without food, light, or sleep. It was there, according to his own writing, that the voice began to speak. It didn't speak in words at first, only in impressions, images, chants, rhythmic patterns that repeated in his dreams. Fletcher described it as a grammar of domination, a method not merely for controlling children or criminals, but entire populations. The Doctrine of Correction, completed in 1786, is perhaps the most disturbing document ever produced on American soil. Bound in black calfskin and hidden within a private library in Boston until its rediscovery in 1991, the book details a multi-phase system of mass behavioral conditioning, combining theology, architecture, diet, sleep deprivation, linguistic restrictions, and social hierarchy to engineer not just obedience, but consensual servitude. Here's what's worse. Portions of the doctrine were copied by members of the Order of the Lantern, a secretive society that emerged in New England after the Revolution. Many of its founding members were former Fletcher students, men who had gone on to positions of power in banking, education, and early government. Their symbol? A single eye above a child's bowed head. Beneath it, the phrase in Latin, "In fiat voluntas tua," let thy will be done. The doctrine was never made public, but its strategies were. Slowly, subtly, they leaked into American public schools, early factories, asylums, and reformatories. Silent lines, standardized drills, recitations, detentions, the illusion of order as a moral good, and at the root of it all, a lie, that discipline is love, that obedience is salvation, that fear is the price of growth. By the time of his death in 1794, Fletcher believed he had succeeded. His final journal entry reads, "I have not educated boys, I have constructed pillars, foundations, engines of righteousness to govern what is to come." But what came was not righteousness. It was something far colder, far more precise. You were never meant to ask why you had to raise your hand to speak, why desks were arranged in rows, why bells dictated your every move. But these weren't arbitrary decisions. They were architectural, psychological, ritualistic. They were the fingerprints of Josiah Fletcher. By the early 1800s, a quiet revolution had begun, not on the battlefield, but in the classroom. Massachusetts led the charge. Horace Mann, often called the father of American public education, praised discipline and moral instruction as the core of civic virtue. But buried in the footnotes of his private correspondence were references to the Salem method, a term now understood to be a sanitized reference to Fletcher's practices. The same man who once imprisoned boys for smiling during prayer had become a ghost in the machinery of a new republic. Schools were no longer places of inquiry, they were engines of uniformity. Every element had a purpose. The bells, they were not just to keep time, they were to condition time, to break the natural rhythm of thought and replace it with external control. The rows of desks, not for efficiency, but for surveillance. Each child exposed, each mind ordered. The Pledge of Allegiance, a loyalty oath, recited daily, eyes forward, right hand over heart, like scripture, like ritual, like surrender. By 1850, Fletcher's influence had become institutionalized. School discipline codes across New England echoed the language of the Covenant Academy. Phrases like spiritual correction, moral failing, obedience through hardship, all appeared in teacher training manuals. What began as torture in a hidden cellar had now become pedagogy in plain sight. And the results? A generation of men who believed compliance was character, that questioning authority was rebellion, that suffering was the price of virtue. And it didn't stop with schools. Factories adopted the same model. Military barracks, orphanages, prisons, each one an echo of the academy, each one built on the core Fletcher principle. A man's will must be broken young, so that the cage becomes his cathedral. And we wonder why modern life feels like ritual without meaning, labor without purpose, obedience without joy. You were taught to submit before you even learned to think. If this is striking a nerve, it should. Now comment below the phrase, "The cage is not the cathedral," twice. Once for what they did to you, once for what ends today. Imagine this, a boy kneeling on frozen stone reciting scripture until his voice breaks. And now picture a man in a prison cell, counting days carved into concrete, whispering rules he didn't write. Different locations, same design, same architects. The Fletchers didn't just shape minds, they shaped institutions. By 1825, the philosophy of moral rehabilitation began sweeping through America's penal system, but it wasn't a new idea. It was a repackaged doctrine, born in the reflection chambers beneath the Covenant Academy. The first prisons modeled on this ideology weren't called prisons at all. They were called houses of reform, but the walls were thick, the windows narrow. Solitary confinement was not punishment, it was correction, a term lifted directly from Josiah Fletcher's journals. The Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, a marvel of modern punishment, boasted of its moral silence. Inmates were forbidden from speaking, lights dimmed, isolation complete. Why? Because silence broke the ego. It erased identity. It reprogrammed the will, just like it had with those boys in Salem. These ideas didn't evolve. They migrated. Samuel Fletcher's writings on progressive submission through deprivation were discovered in a Yale archive in 1907. The same year, new prison wardens began implementing tiered isolation units, reward punishment matrices, and surveillance corridors where every movement could be seen, judged, and corrected. They didn't call it torture, they called it progress. By the 20th century, Fletcher's principles were embedded not just in prisons but in culture: obedience as virtue, silence as strength, pain as purification. Have you ever wondered why American prisons emphasize punishment over rehabilitation? Why solitary confinement, outlawed in many countries, still exists here? Because this system was never meant to restore, it is built to replicate the academy. To grind men down until their resistance is gone, until they ask permission to breathe, until they forget what freedom feels like. The Fletchers are long dead, but their ideology lives in your school, your job, your jail, your church. You were told you were born free, but the curriculum was captivity. The punishment was programming. They called it assimilation. But what they meant was erasure. In the late 1800s, as America expanded westward, it encountered something it couldn't control: identity. Native languages, traditions, spiritual systems, ways of being that couldn't be tamed by rifles or treaties. So the government changed tactics. They turned to something far older and far more insidious. They turned to education. Between 1879 and 1918, over 150,000 Native American children were ripped from their families and forced into government-sanctioned boarding schools. The most notorious, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Its motto: kill the Indian, save the man. That wasn't metaphor, it was mission. And if the phrase sounds familiar, it should. Josiah Fletcher once wrote that, to redeem the soul, one must first extinguish its former language. Nearly identical wording was found in Bureau of Indian Affairs training manuals 150 years later. Coincidence or continuity? Inside those schools, children were beaten for speaking their native tongue. Their hair was cut, the sacred severed with scissors. They were given English names, Christian hymns, forced labor, and daily sermons on obedience. But this wasn't just religious zealotry. It was a replica. The architectural plans for some native schools mirrored the layout of the Covenant Academy: long corridors, surveillance alcoves, and isolation cells for moral infractions. Some institutions even featured reflection rooms, identical in function and philosophy to the Fletchers' infamous chambers. Why? Because the architects of these boarding schools were not educators. They were military men and Protestant ministers, many trained in the same Ivy League circles where Samuel Fletcher's theories were preserved. This wasn't education, it was conversion therapy for an entire people. Children entered these schools sinners, singing the songs of their ancestors. They left as strangers to themselves. Thousands died, buried in unmarked graves behind whitewashed chapels. No names, no prayers, just silence. And even those who survived were never the same. If you're still watching, comment twice below. They buried the name, but not the truth. They buried the name, but not the truth. You think the system collapsed? It didn't. It adapted. After the boarding school era faded, after the screams of native children were replaced with sanitized history books and patriotic hymns, the machinery of psychological control didn't vanish. It was quietly installed into new institutions, hospitals, seminaries, universities, even the boardrooms of Fortune 500 companies. And guess whose fingerprints are all over it? Samuel Fletcher's journals, once thought lost, resurfaced in a 1947 estate sale in New Haven, Connecticut. They'd been passed down through an unbroken chain of former Yale students tied to early behavioral psychology. Among them was a young academic named John B. Watson, now remembered as the father of behaviorism. Watson's experiments at Johns Hopkins on stimulus-response conditioning bear uncanny resemblance to Samuel Fletcher's cognitive crucibles, a system of reward-punishment loops designed to collapse free will under manufactured stress. The phrasing is different. The goal is not. And Watson's students, they went on to advise advertising agencies, military interrogation units, and the CIA's early behavioral research. Yes, MK didn't come from a vacuum. It came from a lineage. And here's where it gets colder. In 1953, the CIA partnered with psychiatric hospitals in Montreal, Maryland, and Massachusetts to develop deep repatterning techniques. These programs, led by Dr. Ewan Cameron, used electroshock, drug-induced regression, and sensory deprivation to erase a subject's identity and write a new one. They called it psychic driving. Cameron's lab notes referenced case studies of colonial correctional methods. Among them, chillingly, was a photocopy of Samuel Fletcher's 1742 report on spiritual purification through isolation and scriptural immersion. These people didn't just revive the past, they institutionalized it. Today, those same methods echo in corporate onboarding programs that reward blind obedience, in megachurches that script your emotions down to the second, in schools where the goal isn't to educate, it's to condition. The names have changed. The robes became lab coats. The sermons became policies, but the blueprint, still intact. Because the true goal of systems like the Covenant Academy was never morality or salvation, it was compliance, and every generation has been a new classroom. There's a reason you were never taught this in school, because if you knew the roots of your own society, if you truly understood where the systems of power came from, you wouldn't trust a single one of them. Let's finish the puzzle. By the late 19th century, America was industrialized, urbanized, and increasingly unmanageable. Immigrants poured into cities, labor unions formed, and revolutions simmered beneath the surface. The elite needed something more potent than brute force. They needed systematic control of the human psyche. Enter the modern prison industrial complex, a structure that borrowed directly from the Fletcher family's methods: solitary confinement, reflection chambers, deprivation, biblical discipline, the breaking of inmates, lifted straight from Samuel Fletcher's journals on moral conditioning. One of the earliest proponents of this transformation was Zebulon Pike Hastings, a prison warden from Pennsylvania with a Yale education and, disturbingly, a personal collection of pre-revolutionary disciplinary manuscripts, including annotated copies of Martha Fletcher's counseling records. His innovations: cell block isolation, behavioral observation logs, reward-punishment protocols based on perceived contrition. Sound familiar? But the prison wasn't the end goal. It was the prototype. By the 1920s, the same model had migrated into public schooling: desks in rows, bells dictating movement, standardized testing that punished deviation. It wasn't education. It was early population conditioning. Then came the Cold War. Governments, terrified of losing ideological control, turned to behavioral scientists for answers. They didn't want to inspire loyalty. They wanted to manufacture it. The CIA, the FBI, the Pentagon, they all funded research into psychological manipulation, interrogation resistance, and mass obedience. And always, buried in the scene, ear references were echoes of the Covenant Academy. Documents classified under project titles like Artichoke, MK and Monarch contain footnotes linking them to colonial-era correctional case studies. The Fletcher family's legacy didn't die. It evolved. It became architecture: digital, invisible, global. Now they don't need to punish you to control you. They just need you to conform. And the scariest part? Most people do it willingly. Do you ever wonder why certain thoughts feel dangerous? Why asking certain questions makes people uncomfortable? Why you hesitate before speaking truths that burn in your chest? It's not fear. It's programming. What began in the candlelit chambers of the Fletcher Academy has become the scaffolding of your modern life. You live inside an echo of their design. Only now, the reflection chambers glow with fluorescent light, and the doctrine is broadcast through glass screens. Let me show you how they've mastered invisible control. From birth, you're processed, registered, documented, tracked. You're given a number, then handed over to institutions. Schools teach obedience, not wisdom. They don't cultivate sovereign minds, they mold compliant workers. Think about it. You sit when told, you speak when permitted. You're rewarded for regurgitating, punished for questioning. It's not education. It's initiation into systemized obedience. By adulthood, most men have forgotten what real autonomy even feels like. They mistake routine for discipline, distraction for peace, submission for morality. Why? Because society doesn't need free men. It needs manageable ones. Just like the Fletcher boys, broken in the name of righteousness, modern men are taught that compliance equals virtue. But the truth is darker. You've been conditioned to police yourself. They don't need guards when you shame your own curiosity. They don't need chains when you defend the very system that imprisons you. Look at media. Algorithms now act as the chapel bell, calling you not to prayer, but to distraction. 7 times a day you're summoned by pings, scrolls, feeds, ritualized engagement, digital conformity, thoughts sanitized by consensus. And if you resist, mocked, censored, isolated. Sound familiar? This is not accidental. This is institutional memory, the ghost of the Fletcher mythos. Reborn in pixels and policies. Their theology has become ideology. Their punishment has become policy. Their whispers are now your thoughts. And the most terrifying part, you feel it. Every time you hesitate, every time you bury your voice, every time you trade authenticity for acceptance. This was always the goal, to make you complicit in your own containment. You were never meant to find this. The Fletcher family didn't disappear when the academy closed. They didn't vanish into the mist of forgotten history. No, they evolved. They went underground, not beneath buildings, but beneath names, beneath foundations, beneath the very skin of the new American order. They became lawyers, judges, advisors to presidents, patrons of elite universities, architects of policy and doctrine, and they changed their name. Records from 1814 show the last known descendant of Josiah Fletcher, one Edmund T. Fletcher, quietly marrying into the Winthrop banking dynasty in Boston. From that moment on, the name Fletcher vanishes from public record, but the methods survive. 1 generation later, a Winthrop heir funds the expansion of Eastern State Penitentiary, America's first reform-based prison system. It just so happens to mirror the psychological architecture of the Fletcher Academy: isolation, silence, ritual humiliation, and enforced reflection. Coincidence or continuity? And it doesn't stop there. An 1891 Yale thesis, authored by a man named Samuel T. Witmore, a descendant of the merchant who first confronted the Fletchers, reveals chilling details. He writes of private meetings between New England elites to discuss national character formation through moral architecture. He lists names like Harriman, Rockefeller, Peabody, each one tied in some form to the descendants of Fletcher ideology, families obsessed with shaping future generations not through inspiration, but through containment. And then there's the most damning piece. A sealed document discovered in 1987 inside the walls of Salem's Old North Church. A confession of sorts, not from a victim, but from a proud practitioner. In it, Samuel Fletcher details plans to export the Academy's methods to institutions of higher learning, correction, and government. He wrote, "The broken soul is the clay from which obedient citizens are shaped. We do not punish rebellion, we extract its roots." Let that settle. This isn't just a story about a sinister school, it's the hidden template behind the American psyche. The ghosts of the Fletcher family aren't just haunting old buildings, they're in boardrooms, They're on policy committees. They write your children's textbooks. And now, you've been shown the underlayer, the skeletal system of spiritual control wrapped in the flesh of patriotism, morality, and law. So speak it now, and speak it twice in the comments below. The reflection chamber is broken. The reflection chamber is broken. Because now that you've seen through the veil, there's no going back. This is the rational past, and the truth you just heard is a weapon.